my background is more in plant ecology, so I'm not a viticulturalist. So Thibaut, I learned more than you guys at these things. Thibaut's been taking me by the hand for a few years now. We started working together 5 or 6 years ago up in Napa, and so I've learned a lot from him, and I appreciate his insight, not only from a viticultural point of view, but also talking about maturation and actually bringing the fruit into the winery. He sort of is one of the unique people that follows fruit the whole way. I sort of stop at harvest and try to do the best we can. So with that said, I think I'll talk a little bit about what I saw in terms of the 2014 vintage relative to the 2013. And I'm at Cal State Monterey Bay, so we do a lot of work in Monterey County, some work down here, and we've developed a model, and I'll show you that here. Let's see here. I've got to figure out how these work. There we go. So a lot of work that I've done is around water balance modeling, and so we're applying some of this technology to vineyards to develop a forecast report, and it's just a simple water balance model where we keep track of the inputs through either grower irrigation and rainfall. We add the inputs to soil moisture, we subtract off canopy ET, and we subtract off any deep drainage, which is just when soil moisture exceeds field capacity, we get some deep drainage, and we just keep a running balance of soil moisture over the season. And so my talk's going to focus on what did we see in terms of the canopy from satellite imagery, because we use, in this particular case, we use satellite imagery to tell us what canopy growth is doing, and if we know canopy growth, we can make an estimate of ETC, and then when we add all these into the model, we can track soil moisture on a daily basis and make an estimate of soil moisture and fine water stress. So I'll start out talking about the temperature and the NDVI, and then moving from that, applying those inputs to a model to see how that might have affected water stress. So we provide some forecasts for growers, and we've been working primarily with Constellation. And so last year we provided forecasts for 13 vineyards in California, from Sonoma down to San Luis Obispo County here. And what I'm going to talk about, well, before we get into that, it's based on using satellite imagery to look at the canopy over time and track phenology. We'll look at some of that. We bring in the daily CIMMYS weather data. We access the USDA soils database, and we also bring in grower irrigation logs. And what I'm going to talk to you about today is just compiling some of the information from those reports for 2014 in terms of what we saw and some of the trends. And because we're working with Constellation in this area, it's primarily large-scale production vineyards where yields might average 5 to 8 tons per acre. So that said, I guess the other thing I should mention is because we do run the model over a number of sites, we have a number of areas where we can test it relative to leaf water potential. So we make an estimate of soil moisture, and we translate that into an estimate of leaf water potential. And I think, as you can see from the data, the model doesn't work great in one area, but it seems to track trends that we see over the state. So that said, let's get into seeing kind of what happened with the weather, and then the NDVI, and then how that affected stress, at least estimated by the model. I think both Martine and Thibaut brought up a really good point. I think 2013 was a challenging year. It was real dry, and I think at least some of the growers that I worked with were a little bit surprised, and they hit stress a little bit early in the season because it was such a dry year. And so I think coming into 2014, they learned from 2013 that I got to be a little more careful about soil moisture early in the season. And in some cases, we might have seen an over-response. I think that both Thibaut and Martine talked about. And if you put too much water, and especially even though it was a dry year in 2014, we got rainfall in real opportune times, February and March. So even though we didn't get much rainfall at the start of 2014, the rainfall that we got was really effective in terms of promoting canopy growth. And so I think when you add irrigation in on top of that, you have to be careful, because on the one side, you you want to support the water with enough vines, or support the vine with enough water so that you don't hit early season stress that can cause loss of berries and flowers. But on the other side, you don't want to over-irrigate and cause your canopy to take off on you, and then it gets too big, and then you have the consequences of using your limited soil moisture too early in the season. So it's a challenge for sure. And I think, especially down in this area, obviously we get a lot more rainfall up in Napa than we do down here. I live in Santa Cruz, and we see a big change. It seems like we get a fair amount of rainfall down to about Santa Cruz, and south of Santa Cruz, everything really changes. And so it's interesting to look at California from that point of view. And I think, as some of our prior speakers have mentioned, you guys are obviously dealing with salt accumulation down here, especially if you have saline well sources. So it's been a challenging year, certainly. So what did we see from Monterey County down North Monterey County to South County and then down into San Luis Obispo? I think you've all observed these in different locations. If we look at just the CIMAS data, I think what we noticed in Arroyo Seco, which is North Monterey County, we had the biggest departure, the biggest temperature differences in 2014 relative to 2013. So things got going earlier up there, and there was a larger difference in terms of growing degree days from bud break in North Monterey County, and that diminished as we moved south down to South County. And down here, we didn't see a big difference in terms of the growing degree days derived from air temperature. And so what do we see in the satellite imagery? Is the satellite imagery showing us the same thing? So what we use the Landsat satellite archive. NASA builds and launches these satellites, and then USGS takes over the management of these satellites. And they've been in orbit continuously since the mid-'80s, so it's a nice record to look back on. We can look back on last year, 2 years ago, 3 years ago, and see what the canopy might have done. The newest Landsat 8 satellite launched down in Vandenberg in 2013, and so that's providing, we've got 2 satellites up there now. It's fairly coarse resolution. It's about 100 feet by 100 feet for a pixel, so it doesn't see anything finer than that. That's okay for 5, 6, 10 acre, 40 acre blocks, but when you get to small blocks, obviously it's not giving you that much information. A 10 acre block has about 40 pixels in it. And each satellite passes over the same location on the ground every 16 days. So with 2 satellites now, we get coverage approximately every 8 days. But if we have clouds, then we're going to miss that week. So there are definitely some problems with it. We process the Landsat imagery to NDVI. How many of you are familiar with NDVI when I throw that term out? Yeah, so most of you. It's just a ratio of the red light to the infrared light. And since plants absorb a lot in the red for photosynthesis, and they reflect a lot in the near infrared, then if we take a ratio of those two, it'll be related to vine vigor. So vigorous sites will have a higher NDVI and then lower vigor sites. This is a typical Landsat NDVI image. This is a South County vineyard. These are actually 2 vineyards, and the lower vineyard is 1,200 acres, just to give you a size of the scale. And the dark blue areas are higher vigor areas, and the green and brown areas are lower vigor areas. That brown block on the bottom right there is a replant block. So new vines in 2014. It's interesting to look back at the NDVI over several seasons for a particular vineyard. This is that same vineyard over the last 5 years now in terms of, are we seeing a vintage signature from the satellite imagery? And again, the vintage signature can be modified by management practices, removing cover crop, controlling canopy growth, through irrigation and that sort of thing. But it's interesting to look back. 2011 was quite a bit wetter than 2012, than everything since 2012. And so Thibaut challenged me this year to look at the NDVI and think about it in terms of a vintage, which I hadn't done before. So it was interesting to plot some of these data up and look at some of these patterns. One of the other things we can do with the NDVI, because it's we have multiple dates of imagery. We can go back to last year at the same time, and we can look at what's the NDVI last year and what is it this year relative to last year. So that gives us an index of canopy growth this year relative to where it was last year. So we can take a difference between the two images and get a percent difference and look at that over time. And that's what you see down on the bottom. And brown areas in terms of the color coding mean that canopies were larger at this time last year relative to this year. Blue areas mean that the canopy, brown areas mean that the canopy this year was smaller than they were in the prior year, and blue areas mean the canopy was larger this year relative to the prior year. So we'll look at some satellite imagery from some different vineyards, and we can look at how 2014 played out relative to 2013 over last season. So again, these are the two vineyards in South Monterey County, and we're looking at the difference. Blue areas, this is in May, and so what the NDVI what this image is telling us is that these vineyards had much higher NDVIs in May 2014 relative to May 2013. And that makes sense because that's what we're seeing in terms of canopy development, and that's what we're seeing in terms of the temperature signature. As we start to progress through the season, though, the canopies reached a peak earlier, and then they leveled out. And so now all of a sudden we're seeing that, we're about neutral. White areas are neutral. Blue areas are where the canopy's larger this year than last year, and brown areas are where it's lower. So we're starting to see that even though we had earlier bud break and the canopy took off earlier, we're leveling out now, and things are actually looking pretty similar. Still some blocks where we have blue, but primarily things are looking pretty similar to last year. And by the time we get to September, you can see a number of rock blocks are brown, and so we get to a situation where you have a smaller canopy this year in 2014 than we did last year, or than we did in 2013. We look at another vineyard. This one is a neighboring vineyard here. We see the same sorts of patterns. In June, we were quite a bit ahead in 2014 relative to 2013, but as the season progressed, canopies actually got a little bit smaller in 2014 relative to 2013. So this is important because it impacts how much water the vines need over the course of the season. And just because you start out hot at the beginning of the season, it doesn't mean that you're going to need to necessarily support that vine with as much water as you did the prior season. This is just a plot of those vineyards in terms of looking at mean NDVIs by block. 2015 in the red, 2014 in the red, and 2013 in the blue. And you're seeing the same sort of general patterns that farther north, we saw a bigger difference between 2014 and 2013. And as we came down to Paso, then that difference seemed to diminish. So I think we just touched on a lot of these, but we'll sort of re-summarize. I think warmer temperatures earlier in the season is what we saw in 2014. Faster and greater accumulation of growing degree days. So if we use a growing degree day model to estimate what the canopy is going to be, we're also going to expect to see canopy growth. That's why we have to try to tie it back to the NDVI, because as Thibault mentioned, some of these growing degree day models, sometimes they work and sometimes they don't. There's obviously more to canopy growth than just temperature. And so earlier bud break and earlier canopy growth, I think in terms of the NDVI, what it showed us is we reached our peak canopies sooner in the year, and then the canopies tailed off relative to 2013. And so how do these interact? If we take all of this information and we put it into a water balance model, how does this all, what happens? And so we ran the water balance model, and we looked at 2013 relative to 2014 in terms of water stress. And what we saw, basically, North Monterey County, these are primarily whites that are grown here. 2014, because the canopies got larger earlier, we saw a little bit more stress in terms of what the model would predict. But then, because the canopies got smaller, we saw a little bit less stress In this vineyard, they used about the same amount of water in 2013 relative to 2014. We go to South Monterey County. Again, you see the signature. The differences between 2014 and 2013 are still pretty large. We got earlier stress, but then again, the stress seemed to tail off a little bit. And again, this is obviously moderated by grower management practices in irrigation. And so it's tough sometimes when you're looking at water practices and water stress, you don't always see a vintage effect because we have control over that. We go to the San Luis Obispo County vineyard. Early season, again, we saw greater water stress. But again, the differences weren't that big between 2013 and 2014, primarily because the differences in the canopy weren't that large. I think talking to the growers that we worked with in Monterey and San Luis Obispo County, they saw sort of larger yields in 2014 relative to 2013. I think we can talk about some of the mechanisms for that, but at least in North Monterey County, they had nice warm weather during flowering, and it seemed to think that really helped out a lot. So in summary then, how did warmer temperatures and earlier vine growth affect the seasonal water stress profiles? I think, on a geographical level, we saw large differences in the north relative to fairly small differences between 2014 and 2013 down here. Earlier bud break, warmer temperatures during flowering. And it sounds like you guys had hot temperatures down here during flowering, and maybe it was a little bit too warm last year. I don't know. We can talk more about that. But then as we moved along through the season, we hit, sort of a critical water stress of 10 bars, which you can use to stop canopy growth. We hit that earlier. And then in August and September, with the smaller canopies, we had a little bit less stress in 2014 relative to 2013. So I thought I'd just finish up with some interesting news about this year, 2015. Where are we now? It seems like we've gotten a good amount of precipitation. At least we did in December, and then somebody turned off the spigot. So we did recharge some soil moisture there, and things are looking up. But obviously, we haven't had a lot of rainfall since then. And so where are we going to be there? It seems like you guys getting earlier bud break this year than last year. Some places, yeah. So maybe earlier bud break. Need more rainfall. So stay tuned for vintage 2015. Thank you. Oh, and I listed myself as a novice winemaker, so I had to because I needed some cred here, so I had to show our label up there. So yeah, Thibaut. Yeah, these are sort of. Oh yes, thank you. Yeah, I have to repeat the question because we're recording it. So yeah, what was the range of water balances that were applied to the vineyards that I worked on? These are large-scale commercial production vineyards. So I think on average they have a 5x8 spacing, and so we, anywhere from about 180 up to 350 gallons per vine, depending upon the vineyard. North Monterey County, because it's primarily white wines and it's production scale. They use a lot of water up there, and so, but they had great yields this year too, in 2014 relative to 2013. But I didn't ask about the quality, so yeah. Any other questions? Yeah.
Related to your opening slide where you do that, can you give a sense of how much water is being lost in reverse evaporation? We all just showed all the water in it.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. Yeah, I'll repeat the question. Thank you, Jimmy. Yes, yeah. So what do we have a sense for how much soil evaporation, how much water, irrigation water, is lost through soil evaporation? It's an important part of the water balance. We sort of make the assumption that the canopy is covering the soil at that time of year, or during most of the time of year when you have the water out there. So we don't calculate it, so it is an error. So we will underestimate the loss of water leaving the system without that. I don't have a sense for what soil evaporation is. Do you, Thibault? Yeah. So yeah, certainly if that water falls into a sunlit portion of soil, then you're going to get a lot more evaporation. I think what's important is a cover crop. Cover crop uses a lot of water prior to bud break. And so it's important to track the cover crop. And, we do that in the model. We start from January 1st. We use the satellite imagery to track the cover crop. And we try to calculate how much water is the cover crop using so that we know going into bud break about what the soil moisture is. Gives us a much better estimate. Yeah. No, I don't. But I can tell you that, 5x8, and if you're spraying under the canopy, maybe you're getting 50% cover of the cover crop on a rough average. It can be a fair amount of water when we get into this time of year because we're getting a lot of solar radiation. And so I think it's something that you need to pay attention to because.
Pretty good survey that. Yeah, 22 gallons per plant.
Yeah. That could be right, yeah. And so if we're talking, 200 to 300 gallons per vine, you're talking 10 to 5 to 10% of your total water. So yeah, I think in a dry year especially, you want to pay attention to how much cover you have on your cover crop because you can be using, valuable soil moisture that you could keep later on in the season. So, yeah, thank you. Any other questions? All right, well, thanks so much. Appreciate it.